the Director of Education here at the Memorial. Good to see you out for our Lunchbox lecture. We also have people tuning in for the live stream right now. And remind you, those who are watching and here in the pavilion, the live stream will be available later, so you can have a repeat. And get to see it all over again if you like. My pleasure to introduce our speaker, who well known to many of you, I'm sure, but Michelle Wright currently anchors Pittsburgh's Action News 4 on weekday mornings, but she's from here, native of Lynchburg, graduate of Liberty University. She's been at WTAE since 1994 and has been honored with many awards, including 3 Regional Emmy awards. Participates in a lot of charity events in her spare time, serves as the media spokesman for Race for the Cure, Project Bundle Up, and the National Alliance for Mental Health, all very worthy causes, and has some interesting hobbies, reading, of course, antiquing, and this one really does interest me. I'll talk about it later, raising bee colonies, because of a story she did once on the current threat to honeybees in the United States. But her full-time job, of course, is wife and mother, and we are pleased to have her join us today to speak about her book and her research she has done, The Secret Diary, the true story of World War II POW Marvin Doyle. And you are going to love this story. So I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you. I am glad you're here. I know most people are watching online, so I appreciate you tuning in and joining us for this. This is the story of my neighbor's husband who kept a secret diary while being held prisoner of war in Stalag Luft 1, which was in Garth, Germany. And I know a lot of people are watching who also have relatives that were kept in that prison camp, so thanks for tuning in. Feel free to comment on the YouTube page. We're monitoring the comments, so if you have something to share, we would love to hear that too. Marvin wanted to make sure that his wife, Ann, knew about what happened to him. So what he did was create a secret diary while he was in the prison camp, and he was able to do that because the YMCA and the Red Cross gave the soldiers that were kept in the prison camps care packages, which included cigarettes. And Marvin started seeing that the discarded cigarette packages would be perfect to keep a diary and a log. They were given notebooks. Some of you may realize that to write in. The Germans wanted to keep them busy, so I have some of the actual notebooks. These were approved so they could keep recipes, addresses, write poems, which Marvin did, and we'll talk about that later. But they were not allowed to write down anything to do with the war, any details about that. So what he did was he wrote what happened to him on the back of the cigarette packages, and then he hid it. So the story of Marvin is one of courage, of service to his country, of survival, but it's also a love story between he and his wife, Ann. And I didn't talk before about how I was supposed to advance these slides. So I just hit the middle button or the arrow?
Yeah, the arrow.
How about that? Okay, there we go. So this is Marvin, and the love of his life, Ann Whitlow. She was born, by the way, nearby here in Rocky Mount. And he was from Roanoke, Virginia. Marvin graduated high school from Roanoke and then immediately enrolled in Virginia Tech, where my brother went to school. He was an only child and his parents doted all over him. Marvin at Virginia Tech met Ann. She was not a student at the school. It was rare for women to attend college back then. But she worked at the nearby telephone company, Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, as an operator. And so that's how they met. You can see this is the invitation to the spring dance. They fell in love, got married. He was 21 and she was 18. He took a job with a life insurance company, Life and Casualty Insurance Company, and they started their lives together. But Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And soon after the Congress passed the Secret Service, Selective Service Act, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for service. Marvin was 29 when he registered, and soon after is when Pearl Harbor got bombed, and the Secretary of War started pulling out capsules with numbers, draft numbers in it. It took a while before Marvin's had numbers to be drawn, but about a year and a half later, when Marvin was 33, his number was drawn, and he did not plan on being a soldier. He had never stepped foot in an airplane before. He had never fought. He had never planned this, but he had no choice. He left Ann and his parents and flew for the very first time to start training. He went a few different places to train. He had no idea what branch of service that he would get. Back then, he just didn't know, but he got picked to be part of the Army's Air Force. Again, he never stepped foot in a plane, but he started training to become an aerial gunner. Ann stayed home and continued her job as an operator. He wrote her constantly, and I have some of those letters telling her how much he missed her. So this is the squad that he was assigned, and I want to take a second to talk to you about this entire crew. I want you to listen as I quickly read through there about how different they were. They had different backgrounds. They came from different places. They were called the Cottontail Squad. A lot of people have talked about that in the past because their tails of the plane were painted white, so he was part of that. This is the 450th Bomber Group and the 721st, again, he was a race gunner. So here they are, and I would like to pay tribute to all of them. Starting on the bottom row from the left, this guy's name was George Maljanian. He was from Rhode Island, a bombardier. He worked for Liberty Tool and Gauge, and his parents had just immigrated here from Turkey. The next guy right here is Alvin Millspaw from Oakland, California. He's the co-pilot. Next is pilot Ireland Kearns. He's from West Virginia. James Mell is from Texas. He was a navigator, and he was raised in an orphanage. He worked for the railroad. The back row, the far left, is a guy from Pittsburgh, where I live now. His name is Robert McVeigh. He was the radio man. The next guy is Michael Krivinoff from Indiana, the nose gunner. He was a pipe fitter, and his parents had just come here from Czechoslovakia. Wayne Rennie in the middle back, he was from Oregon, the tail gunner, and he was an only child. He worked in the sawmill with his father, and his parents had just immigrated from Finland. Of course, next is Marvin Doyle, the guy we're here for. He was an aerial gunner. And the last guy is Rocco Stefano from New York, a ball gunner, and his parents had just arrived here from Italy. So you can see how hugely different their backgrounds are, their training. None of them planned to become part of the military, but they were assigned together to work together to defeat Hitler, and that's what they were going to learn how to do. I told you the reason we're here is that Marvin kept a secret diary, and so the following account I took from this diary, just to let you know. They first started out in Italy, which is down in the booth of Italy, which was beautiful, but they got into their plane, a B-24 bomber called a Liberator, for those of you interested in that, and they had to fly one mission every 3 days. If you've ever heard of the famous Tuskegee Airmen, they helped escort the planes to their missions, and they were really good at their jobs and were heavily requested for that. So Marvin and his crew went on 5 bombing missions with no problem. They would head across the Adriatic Sea, and the planes, as you know, were open, so it was freezing. So when they went on their training back in Miami, Florida, they had to train wearing the huge gloves and the huge warm suit that would come in handy because they had to learn how to change the rifle and all their machinery wearing those big gloves because it would get well below zero in the plane. The metal on the guns and the armory would freeze up in the sky that high, and so their skin could not touch it. So that was one thing that they learned in their training. They would wear oxygen masks. It would freeze around their face, because it would, all the condensation would get cold and they would come with frostbite around on that seal. It was their 6th mission. They were set to hit a marshalling yard in a railroad in Sarajevo in Yugoslavia when they hit. They were supposed to try to stay away from one area called Mostar because the flak was so intense there. But that's when they were shot down. I have the telegrams that were received by Anne. One says that Marvin had been shot down and they didn't know his whereabouts, his status. The other telegram says that he was a POW, so I can show you these later. But they kept everything, so I was able to have them for you to see. So we know that Marvin became a POW, and we know that he was trying to avoid that area because of the flak. And for those of you who need to be brought up to speed on what flak is that the Nazis used, is they would put a projectile up in the air at the same height the planes were flying, and those projectiles would explode, and all that flak was metal shards that would go through the plane as the planes were flying. So that's what actually brought Marvin's plane down, was all of that anti-aircraft flak. And if you've seen any movies or stories about it, it leaves that black cloud of smoke in the sky, and that's filled with different materials that the planes would fly through and get damaged. So the first thing that the flak did was knock out their communication. So all of the people on the plane suddenly couldn't hear each other to communicate. They were all throughout the plane, and the motors started quitting. The number 1 motor, the number 2 motor, and they realized they were going to go down. They first dropped all their bombs to lighten the load the best they could. Marvin wrote that there was about 100 holes in the plane, and they knew they were not going to make it. So what they did was put on their parachutes and prepared to jump. They had never trained for parachuting. So the guys were strapping on their parachutes for the very first time, and they'd been told how it worked, but they had never practiced that in any of their training. So they were scared, obviously. So the guy that Marvin's standing to in this plane, I zoomed in on that for a specific reason. This was Rennie. Remember, he was the tail gunner in the plane. He was an only child from Finland originally. When everybody was told to get out of the plane, Rennie froze. So Marvin is writing that he's in the waist of the plane. Rennie was the tail gunner, and he couldn't move. He was stuck on the catwalk, as Marvin writes in his diary. Marvin shook him, banged him up against the side of the plane to get him to understand they had to jump, but Rennie was scared and just frozen. Marvin dragged him to the side, made sure his parachute was on, and Rennie, as described in the diary, kind of smiled a strange smile and jumped out of the plane and never pulled his chute. And he died. And that haunted Marvin his whole life, thinking about not being able to save Rennie. All the other crew members survived, and they were all captured. He describes falling the parachute about 1,000 feet, pulling the rope, getting a jolt, heading straight for a river. The wind took him away from the river. He landed on some rocks and severely hurt his ankle. And he describes in the diary that you can see back there, I have it displayed out for the first time. 100 Nazi soldiers were on him immediately, and he was waiting to be shot. They took everything he had, his wristwatch, his knife, his helmet, everything that they had, and he hobbled to a house. The Nazis said to him that to take off his boot, that Americans apparently like to die with their boots on. They took it off and they wanted him to put it back on. And suddenly a German officer pulled up and saw what was happening and stopped the other Nazis from trying to kill him and said, no, we're going to make him a prisoner of war. And Marvin describes how that officer saved his life by deciding that he would be a POW. And that's his document from the actual prison camp, Stala Luft 1. He writes in his diary about eating cabbage soup and vile coffee and black German bread. He talks about barely being fed and having to eat bugs. He said they had something like potato bugs like we have in America. And he said at first they didn't want to eat it, but finally they just had to eat it, bugs and all, because they were so hungry. They marched through Germany in the cold. He talks about marching hundreds of miles in snow to get to a couple of different places. One of the first places they went was Dulov 3. If you've ever seen the movie The Great Escape, it was a pretty famous movie. He stopped by there momentarily, and then they kept moving. He went to Vienna, Austria, and talked about how the Austrians were mad because the Allies kept bombing around them, and they were rattled, but he was confused that they were yelling at him. But he finally got to where he was going to be, which is here. And for those of you watching from my Stalag Luft 1 group, this you will recognize is Stalag Luft 1. It's way up in North Germany, right near the ocean there. He arrived there December 23rd, 1944. And if you look, let's see, on the top of the slide, on the top right, as you're looking at it, is that church. A lot of the prisoners drew pictures of the church, wrote poems about the church. That town is called Barth, Germany. And so that's where they were. He arrived December 23rd, and there's another famous movie about a violinist who handcrafted a violin out of table legs, and he would peel off glue from underneath tables. He handmade a violin, and on Christmas Eve, the very next day that Marvin was there, he played Silent Night on his violin, and reportedly even the German soldiers cried at that. It was a very famous movie, if you've ever seen that he played Silent Night. So that is about the time frame that Marvin was there. So it's freezing. This is a map of this Stalag Luft 1 next to Barth, Germany, and you can see it's right beside the Baltic Sea, and it was freezing. He described it being 30 below zero when he arrived. So he starts getting worried that he's not going to make it out alive, and he wants Anne to know what happened. And he doesn't really know what to do. So again, he got those cigarette packages. They're all on display back there. I rarely bring them out because I'm scared something's going to happen to them, but for anybody who's here in person, please go look at them. Cigarettes were really important because they bribed the Nazi guards with them. So they would bribe them a lot, whoever was bribable, and but he used the cigarette wrappers to tell his story. He kept a 37-page diary. And again, the Nazis would look at anything that they were writing, so Marvin hid it, and he often wrote in the diary how he was scared he was going to get caught and punished or even killed. But thankfully, he was never caught. Here are some of the cigarette packages that he used, all different kinds. Just to show you a couple of pages of the 37-page diary, you can see this is the first page saying it's now January. He has no paper, so I'm collecting all the cigarette packages I can. And I think it's significant that he wrote all of the following I'm setting down in order to help remember dates and places, only as most of the happenings I hope I can forget. Another page is where he talks about being shot down. This is page 9, and he describes it like hail on a tin roof. The tail gunner got out and laid down on the catwalk between the waist and the tail. The flak was so thick it looked like you could walk from one verse to another. And the last one that I'll tell you about here, because I know that most of you are on your lunch break, so I want to keep going. He talks about his capture and how he huddled up because it was so cold. And for breakfast, they received that vile cup of liquid they called coffee. And he seemed to be really upset about that. And he talks about the cabbage soup, which was practically water with a piece of cabbage. And he wrote about all the bugs in the soup, and much more on the diary. When they get to Barth, Germany, this is one more page. We arrived at Stalag number 1, Barth, Germany, on the 23rd of December, and it was about 30 degrees below zero with snow all around, and we walked 3 miles to our prison. And that was after walking hundreds of miles up the whole country of Germany. So the diary goes into much more detail, but I just wanted to give you some highlights. He also writes how he's wondering if Anne knows that he's alive and she's waiting for him, and he hopes to see her again, and he really hopes that she's waiting for him. One interesting thing about this is So I live in Pittsburgh now, and I tracked down one of the guys that Marvin wrote about named Joe Miller. And I met his family. Joe passed away. But I met his family, and I wanted to hear all the stories about him. And they said, he kind of liked to tell tall tales about what happened there and be sarcastic. And I said, well, what did he say? And they said, well, he talked about playing basketball. And he talked about making moonshine and brew. And I told them that that was probably true, that the Red Cross did give them some sporting things to play sports with, including basketballs, and there's photos of that. And the soldiers were known for taking fruit and letting it ferment. And I said, he was probably telling you the truth. And they were really surprised to hear after all these years that their dad was telling the truth about everything that happened to him. Another really interesting thing is something about one of the German guards. So his name was Henry, and he had been to America, and he was trying to start a life in America. And he opened a butcher shop in New York and was hoping to change his whole life. And his mother got sick back in Germany. So he had to go back to Germany momentarily to take over her grocery store. And he was waiting to return to America. But the war started and the Nazis drafted him, and he had no choice, and he became a Nazi guard, even though he didn't want to be one. The other prisoners called him Henry the Butcher, because he was a literal butcher in New York City. He could speak English very well, so he talked to them. He disappeared after the war, and his daughter is still alive today in Germany and are trying to find out any information she can about her father. And so she tells an interesting story about her vantage point, which again is much different than Marvin's, but I think that's really interesting. There were a few escape attempts. 2 people made it out of this particular stalag. The water table was really high, though, so they tried to dig tunnels, but they would run right into water because they were so close to the sea. So they had a really hard time trying to escape. Another super interesting thing that happened in the stalag is this. They started an underground newspaper. And this is one of the most fascinating things. I don't have any evidence at all that Marvin had anything to do with any of this, but this is what was going on in the camp. So they wanted information out there. Some of the British guys made a secret radio. How they knew how to do that, I have no idea. But they put together a radio and they hid it in the wall, and they would listen to the BBC. And they would write notes secretly, and they would hide it when the soldiers came. And they started realizing that any information they had about the war was a real morale booster for the other people held in the camp. So they wanted all the information they put out there. So then they hired a guy, if you want to call it that was an American, that wanted to be a newspaper guy when he got back. And they said, you're hired as the editor of our newspaper. So what they would do is secretly write a newspaper. Here are 2 versions. They were supposed to be destroyed by the last person who read them. Obviously, these 2 were not destroyed, so someone should get in trouble for this, but these survived. I think it's fascinating. The guy that was the editor for this is named Ray Parker, and there's lots of books written about him. The Germans could not catch this newspaper. They knew somehow information was getting out there. What they would do is they would interview all the soldiers that were newly into the camp to get information. They would those soldiers that could speak German would eavesdrop on the Nazis to listen and take notes. And then they had the radio. They added the Voice of America to what they were listening to in the BBC, and Ray Parker would put it all together in these newspapers. How they would distribute it is fascinating. One guy had a fake watch. He took all the instruments out of the inside of the watch, and he would fold it up. He would set the time, what was the correct time because the watch wasn't working. He would be searched by the guards, and he would go from these different sections of the camp. He was allowed to bring different things around, and they would pass around this newspaper. They also had the fake bottoms on the milk jugs that they would use. So all of the guys had all the information, which turned out to be extremely important toward the end because of the events that happened. They beat American journalists, for any of you journalist fans out there. They beat the Americans in reporting the fall of Paris. And D-Day, the invasion of D-Day. They printed that before the rest of the country knew because of all the information they had, which, as a journalist, I think that's fascinating. So the Americans learned that they were getting ready to be liberated. The Russians were coming on one side, the Americans were coming on the other side, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they got to this camp. So they started telling all the Nazi soldiers, you know, we need to negotiate something because you're going to be in trouble whenever the Allies reach our camp. But because they had the information from the hidden radios, that's how they knew that. So the day before the Allies made it to the camp, the Germans tried to get all the prisoners to pack up to march to a different camp. But again, because of the secret newspaper, they realized that they had the upper hand, and so they refused to leave. There was a big standoff, and one morning they woke up and all of the Nazi soldiers were gone, and they were alone, and the Russians came in to rescue them. The Russians brought lots of vodka, and lots of dancing girls, apparently, and lots of potatoes. And so everybody was happy. The Russians, there was a little standoff with them too. The Russians wanted to march them back up through Russia. The Americans, of course, wanted to take them west. So there was a standoff between the Americans and the Russians on that. The Americans won, but it took a couple of weeks to get there. Germany would go on to surrender May 7th of 1945, which was a few weeks after, oh, actually just 1 week after they were liberated, and Japan, of course, did not surrender until September. One of the things I had told you is in the, Jeff, if you want to come on up, in Marvin's books that he was given by the YMCA, they were allowed to write poems. And he wrote one particular poem that I asked Jeff Taylor, longtime anchor for WSET here in Lynchburg, Virginia. I asked Jeff if he would read what Marvin wrote. This is one of Marvin's poems. Again, he wrote this as he was being held prisoner.
Thank you. Quite an honor, Michelle. Appreciate it. By Marvin Doyle. It's easy to be nice, boys, when everything's okay. It's easy to be cheerful when things all go your way. But can you hold your head up and take it on the chin when your heart is breaking and you feel you must give in? It was easy back in Italy among all the friendly folks, but now you miss your comrade's voice, their joyous songs and jokes. The road ahead is stony, and when you're not strong in mind, you'll find it isn't long before you're lagging far behind. You've got to climb that hill, boys. There's no use in turning back. There's only one way home, and it's not along their tracks. So remember, you're Americans. When you reach the crest, you'll see a valley cool and green, America at her best. You know that there is a saying, sunshine always follows rain. And soon to come, you'll come to realize that joy will follow pain. Let courage be your password, fortitude be your guide. And when you feel you must complain, remember those who died.
I'm sure Marvin would love to know that you read that, Jeff. Marvin wrote a lot of other poems that I have in that book that I printed just to document what he wrote. But I think that says a lot that he was able to write those words while he was still being held a prisoner. So Marvin was liberated. Here's his Purple Heart. I also have that on display back there. The guys were taken to Lucky Strike Camp in France, and then they sailed to New York and described crying. So many of them described crying when they saw the Statue of Liberty. By the way, Anne had no idea that Marvin was on his way home because mail was so slow back then. So the government had sent her a message saying Marvin was on his way to expect him. She had moved into a different location to be close to her sister. When the story goes from Anne that when he knocked on her door, she had no idea that he was coming home and she fainted. She loved telling that story. The last thing that I'll do before I take questions, so I do hope you guys have some questions, is this was one of the things that Marvin saved, and that is a letter by George Marshall. I think some of our books got switched, but anyway, George Marshall wrote a letter to all of the service guys that you can see right there, and he talks about the fact, and I'll let you read that, and I think I have a copy back there. He talks about getting involved in government, and you can see what happens when people don't get involved in their government, and you can see what happens when people are intolerant of others, and to beware of that. That, you know, we all have to save our country and do what's right, and he really wanted them as civilians to be good examples. And so Marvin and all of his treasures that he kept from that time period kept this letter, which I also have a copy of, and I thought it was significant, so I wanted to share that. So that wraps up our talk, other than to say that Marvin, when he got back after being cold in 30-degree weather for a long time, for almost a year, he came home, got in, and said, we're moving to the hottest place I've ever known, and that is Miami. So they moved straight to Miami in the sun, and they stayed there. He passed away at the age of 52 from a heart attack. And Anne moved back here to Lynchburg, and that's where my family knew her and cared for her until she passed away. But they enjoyed their time in the sun in Miami after he was so cold for so long. He's now buried in Roanoke at the Evergreen Cemetery. Well, they both are buried at the Evergreen Cemetery in Roanoke nearby, for those of you who've ever been there. So that is my presentation today. Thanks for coming, thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, you can write them online, and we are monitoring whatever anybody's saying online, so you guys can give me a heads up if there's any questions there. Does anybody have any questions here? Yes.
In your research with Marvin, do you know what happened to the other 7 men of the crew?
Thanks for asking. I have been tracking them down like mad. The guy from Pittsburgh, he moved to Miami with Marvin, where it was hot, and he was never married, had no children. Rocco has a big family in New York. They've all passed away. I couldn't find out any information about the pilot from West Virginia or the co-pilot from California, although I've tried. This guy, his son started a jewelry business. His son took over the jewelry business, and they have made some mementos, but also I should say the wife has made jewelry for famous films, movies like The Sopranos, Sex and the City, and so she's a famous jewelry maker.
One of them was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia.
Yes, the Czechoslovakian, let's see, one guy was not pictured here. This guy is from Czechoslovakia. But they just immigrated. So a lot of these people you can see just got here to start a new life, and then they got dragged into the war. And they fought for us. This guy lived in Finland. They had moved here to Oregon, and his parents worked in a wood shop, and he was working in the wood shop too. He was very young. He was the youngest guy in the crew when he got drafted, and he did make it. And Marvin talked about how much that haunted him. And Marvin had a hard time when he came back. He had a lot of nightmares. It didn't go well, and as a lot of you know, the guys that served didn't really want to talk about it much. And so it's hard to find stories, individual stories, but Marvin kept this diary that Anne, his wife, kept, so we're able to have some insight. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned movies like The Great Escape that sort of talk about escaping the prisoner of war camp experience. Did Marvin ever talk about movies like that? Did he like them? Did he go, that just...
Oh, okay, I need to repeat the question. So the question was, did Marvin ever talk about any of those great movies like The Great Escape? I don't know that, no. I do know that he kept a log in his diary that two people were able to escape. Lots of people tried. At the beginning of the war, the Germans thought it was funny. They would capture them and bring them back, and there was not a problem, and it was a slap on the wrist, because mainly the camp was for officers. As the war went on and there was more more and more prisoners, then it got to be more serious and they would be shot. 2 people in his camp were shot and killed. But only 2 people made it out. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
I'm amazed that he was 33 years old when he was drafted.
He's amazed that he was 33 years old and he was named because he's so old. Right? Right. So at first it was anybody, between the ages of 18 or 21 and 35, but then they kept making the draft age younger and older, and he was one of the oldest guys drafted. Yeah, and it took a while. It took a while before they pulled his number, but he was called, and he talked about being a leader. When he was shot down and he hurt his ankle so bad, the Germans kept wanting to shoot him because he was hobbling along when they were marching up through Germany. And he talked a lot about his men helping him, shoulder kind of carrying him along so they wouldn't kill him, and he was appreciative of that. But they respected him that much. Right at the end of the war, when he got drafted. Any other questions? Any questions online? Yep. Yes?
Was he ever involved in any groups or POW reunion groups?
Not as far as I know. I don't know, Dad, did you ever hear Ann talking about Marvin or them going into any of the POW groups or they? No, I don't think so. I think that he was ready to start a new life, and a lot of those guys experienced the same thing. And so I don't know that he was a part of any of that. I do have lots of correspondence back and forth between the government who kept all of those things, and he bought books that were fundraisers, I know, but I don't know how involved he was in any of that. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. For coming today. And please take some time to go back and look at all of Marvin's things. He would really want that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful, great, just a great story, isn't it? It's one that's told many times over, but not many of these stories recorded on cigarette packages. And Michelle did bring the originals that are back there on display for the first time. So take a look if you get a chance, and also some of his other medals, his uniform coat, and some other artifacts. Again, it's just been great to have you here. Let's give Michelle another round of applause. Take us for now. And I'd be remiss if I did not also point out that the book is for sale in our gift shop, which is right back here. So if you'd like to get a copy, and I'm sure Michelle will be happy to autograph it as well. Just have to kind of go in there where the cash registers are, but they'll be happy to take care of you. For those of you here and those of you watching online, remind you that also in October, our Lunchbox lecture is only virtual because our speaker will be in Florida at the time, not here, but Jim Ransom, one of our former board members, a retired submarine captain for the U.S. Navy, will speak on naval operations around D-Day, and you don't want to miss that one as well. So come on, not that, because I say it will only be online in this case, but tune in for that one in October. And watch our webpage and the calendar of events for everything else coming up, because we've got a lot going on this fall. But again, thank you very much, and stick around, look at the artifacts, and talk to Michelle.